The views and opinions expressed in The Fact Is with Hollis Grant are those of Hollis Grant and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Droids Canada Network. Droids Canada Network does not take responsibility for any content or position produced by Hollis Grant and his show. Listener discretion is advised.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for tuning in to another edition of The Fact Is. I'm your host, Hollis Grant, and as we approach episode 100, we are going to be talking about one of the biggest topics on the show, COVID-19. And if this particular podcast was held on YouTube, we surely would have been banned, censored, and taken off due to the information that is being presented. So I'm going to read today from an article from Bloomberg News. And the article is "The Travel Restrictions Removed as Medical Professionals Reiterate the Risk of COVID-19. So as you may be aware, and if you've been following the show, we've discussed a lot of the restrictions and mandates that have happened in the province of Ontario and in the country of Canada. What's happening now is because there is an election coming up very soon, in which the Conservative, or you could say the Republican Party, right wing, if we're going to use those terminologies, there is a new leader, and he's a young leader. He is a great public speaker. He's interesting to listen to, and he has great talking points, and he's able to answer questions, unlike the Liberal government of today. There's a lot of stall tactics or not answering questions when the Liberals are answering questions, especially Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. We've played clips from him before in the past where he talks about his water type bottle thing, the box water scandal that happened, all of his missteps along the way, his black face, his brown face. So much of the population is very excited to see some fresh life. And the Conservatives, the way that they're trending now, have a very good chance to actually take down the Liberal government. So as such, Justin Trudeau needs to start winning some polls. He needs to start looking at how can he start securing votes. And one of the key issues is COVID-19 and the COVID mandates. Now, he's always framed the argument of these mandates are to protect you. We're here to protect you, to protect your family, to keep you safe. The government must keep you safe at all times. And he's done very well by using that messaging and frame that. But as it drew on and as people started talking to relatives in different countries and as mandates started lifting, Canada was still falling behind. America has already since but opened up. No masks on planes, while Europe was still using masks on planes as well. So people were coming to America and going, wait, no one's got this COVID, and people aren't afraid and don't have masks on. So you start seeing Europe start to fall by the wayside, and England leading the charge there, taking off face masks. But in Canada, it still stayed and it still lingered. So it's to the point that if you're unvaccinated, you essentially cannot leave the country because you cannot leave by a plane. You cannot get on a train. Unvaccinated people were subject to 2-week quarantines. If you were to drive across the border to the United States and come back and you were not vaccinated, you could be COVID negative, test negative, and you'd be subject to a mandatory 2-week vacation. However, if somebody that did come over that was vaccinated and did have COVID and was test positive, they only need to isolate for 5 days. So there was a lot of inconsistencies that were happening. And the Trudeau government needs a win. So it was announced that they'll be dropping all of the mandates. All the travel restrictions that are happening at the federal level are being dropped. And we'll read this from the Bloomberg. We won't look at it from the Communist Broadcasting Corporation of Canada, or CBC, Canada's state-run media. But we'll look at it from Bloomberg. The removal of the mask mandates and vaccine requirements has medical professionals and frontline workers reiterating that COVID-19 is still a threat. The federal government announced on Monday, starting October 1st, all COVID-19 entry restrictions will be removed, including testing, quarantine, and isolation requirements for anyone entering Canada. A professor of epidemiology at the University of Saskatchewan, Nazim Mujahideen, said that lifting of the restrictions did not come as a surprise to him and other medical professionals, as Canada could only last so long before joining other countries' regulatory practices. Canada is one of the last countries to remove travel requirements following the US and the UK. Yet, he said, the removal of the requirements does not mean the removal of the threat of COVID-19. On one hand, saying that there's no restrictions now applied, and on the other hand, saying that the pandemic is not over. These two things seem to not go hand in hand, said the doctor. From the beginning, my mantra as tourism minister was safety first, and then travel, said tourism minister Randy Boissonnault in a video statement. Notice the term mantra, and you'll hear a lot of the terminology of mantra, repeating and chanting over and over again, is used in a lot of religious ceremonies. And the reason why that you use these mantras in religious ceremonies is so that you become ingrained as part of the group, and everyone's together worshiping whatever it is that they're worshiping. So you'll see the same rituals that happen over and over again, and no matter what Catholic church that you go to, or whatever Wiccan hippie circle you want to join, you'll see that use of using these mantras so that everyone's the same. Interesting that the Liberal minister would use the terminology of mantra. The Minister of Tourism said that the measures will remain flexible and adaptable, guided by science to make sure that travelers are kept safe while helping the tourism sector recover. Mujahideen said that passengers should continue to wear a mask through all stages of travel to reduce the number of potential infections. Leslie Diaz, the director of airlines for Unifor, a union representing many of Canada's airport staff, which also Unifor is in charge of running the media. And we've covered that on past episodes on droidscanada.com/Hollis Show. You can go back and listen to those ones. And Jerry Diaz, who actually took a step away when he was in trouble for some financing, some money going missing, all of a sudden had to go to rehab for his drug issues. But nonetheless, interesting that Unifor is also in charge of airport staff. Said that there has been a mixed response from workers, as some are happy to no longer have to enforce restrictions, while others are concerned about the health of them and their family. Further concern remains around the timing of the removal of restrictions, as mandates will be lifted just before the start of what could be a more intense flu season, said Mujahideen. Now, on past episodes, we have covered week by week, and we do know from past data, and we've covered this on the show, we're getting into flu season. There will be a flu of some sorts, and what type of flu it will be this year, we've covered those on past episodes. So we know that a flu is coming. So it does seem kind of silly to, well, if you're going to stick by the science, and if you're going to stick by knowing that flu season is coming, and we have statistical proof prior to 2019, we know that the flu is coming, that if you believe the science so much and that masks prevent the spreads, why would you remove it before flu season? So in that sense, I do agree with the doctor. If this is all based on science and having, stopping the spread, why are we doing this before flu season? And that's simple, because it's a political win for the Liberal government. So now they can say that we said this on the show before, that we were the ones to have stopped COVID. The Canadian Union of Pacific Employees, which represents many of Canada's flight attendants, has called upon the federal government to ensure sufficient workplace personal protective equipment is provided to staff once the mandate has been lifted. President of CUPE, the airline division, Wesley Lesock, also said in a statement that that they are thankful members will no longer have to fulfill the difficult role of, quote, mask police on top of their many other duties on board. The timing of lifting the mandate isn't ideal, said Diaz, but let's face it, there's also a number of people who are really happy that the mandate is being lifted. So what do you think? Knowing that coming into a flu season, and we're not talking about COVID-19 necessarily, but a flu season, knowing that if we're to believe the science that masks stop the spread, if we're to believe social distancing, if we're to believe that vaccines stop the spread of COVID-19 or any other type of flu, then why would the government remove these restrictions? If their actions are purely based on the science, then what's right? The science or the government? Because right now you have contradicting information. Or does it come down to a cheap win and a political win so that Trudeau can try to maintain his minority government, knowing that a strong conservative leader is emerging and vying for his job? Feel free to reach out to us on the show through Facebook, through Twitter. And once again, I'd like to thank you for tuning in this week to The Fact Is. I'm your host, Hollis Grant, and you have yourself a great week.
Dun, 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 dun. Salsa shark! We're gonna need a bigger boat!
Throughout history, they have been a part of our Canadian life. Men and women who have made their mission to entertain their fellow man. They've worked hard enough. Isn't it time they had their own podcast?
Droids Canada. This podcast would be great if it wasn't for the internet trolls.
I don't bother them and they don't bother me.
I could do without the bad reviews in the iTunes store.
You have that podcast with that guy who was at that Comic-Con in the last year.
You should hear the barrage of the stupid questions I get on our SoundCloud account. What do you mean there was coughing? How am I going to hear a podcast with coughing?
You feel a lot better if you just rip into the occasional guest.
You're a host who doesn't get paid. You can't just do anything you want while you're recording.
What kind of podcast are you running here anyways?
Droids Canada Podcast present.
You think anyone can see us down here?
Why, you think you want to have sex or something?
Can we?
Droids Canada Podcast. The only show to rip off a Clerks trailer.
You hate people!
But I love Comic-Cons. Isn't it ironic?